The sexual aberrations. Sigmund Freud. The sexual aberrations. The fact of the existence of sexual needs in man and animal is expressed in biology through the assumption of a sexual drive. In this, we proceed by analogy with the nutrition drive, hunger. Popular language lacks a designation equivalent to the word hunger. Science uses libido for this. Popular opinion has very precise representations about the nature and properties of this sexual drive. It would be lacking in childhood, it would appear at the time of puberty and in connection with the maturation process that occurs in it, it would be externalized in the manifestations of irrepressible attraction that one sex exerts on the other, and its goal would be sexual union or, at least, the actions that point in that direction. But we have full grounds to discern in these indications a very unfaithful reflection or copy of reality, and if we take a closer look, we see them riddled with errors, inaccuracies, and hasty conclusions. Let us introduce two terms. We call the sexual object the person from whom the sexual attraction starts, and the sexual goal the action towards which the drive forces itself. If we do so, scientifically gleaned experience shows us the existence of numerous deviations from both the sexual object and the sexual goal, deviations whose relation to the supposed norm demands in-depth investigation. 1. Deviations with respect to the sexual object. The poetic fable of the partition of the human being into two halves, male and female, who aspire to meet again in love, corresponds marvelously with the popular theory of the sexual drive. Point 3. For this reason, it is a great surprise to learn that there are men whose sexual object is not the woman, but the man, and women whose object is not the man, but the woman. These people are called opposite sex, or, better, inverted, and to the fact itself, investment. The number of such people is very high, although it is difficult to find out for sure. A. The investment. Conduct of investments. The persons in question behave entirely differently in different respects. 2. They can be absolute inversions, that is, their sexual object has to be of the same sex, while the opposite sex is never the object of sexual longing for them, but leaves them cold and even disgusts them. In the case of men, this repugnance renders them incapable of performing the normal sexual act, or they do not derive any enjoyment from performing it. B. They can be inverted amphigenes, psychosexual hermaphrodites, that is, their sexual object can belong to their same sex as well as to the other. The investment does not then have the character of exclusivity. C. They can be occasionally inverted, that is, under certain external conditions, among which the inaccessibility of the normal sexual object and imitation stand out. They can take a person of the same sex as a sexual object and feel satisfaction in the sexual act with her. The inverts also show a diverse behavior in their judgment about the particularity of their sexual drive. Some take the investment as something natural, such as the normal considers the orientation of their libido, and they strongly defend their equal rights with respect to normals. Others revolt against the fact of their investment and feel it as a pathological compulsion. Other variations concern temporal relationships. The trait of inversion has always existed in the individual, as long as his memory reaches, or it became noticeable only at a certain time, before or after puberty. 6. This character may be preserved throughout life, or it may disappear at some moment, or represent an episode on the path to normal development, and it may even manifest itself only later in life, after a long period of normal sexual activity. A periodic fluctuation between the normal and the inverted object has also been observed. Of particular interest are cases in which the libido is altered in the direction of inversion after a painful experience has been had with the normal sexual object. In general, these various series of variations coexist independently of each other. In the case of the most extreme form, it can perhaps be regularly assumed that the inversion existed from a very early time and that the person is content with its peculiarity. Many authors would refuse to unite the cases listed here and would prefer to highlight the differences between these groups rather than their common features, which is closely related to how they prefer to view investment. However justified the separations may be, it cannot be ignored that all the intermediate degrees are discovered in abundant number, so that the establishment of series is imposed in a certain way by itself. Investment conception. The first appreciation of the investment consisted in conceiving it as an innate sign of nervous degeneration, in keeping with the fact that medical observers first encountered it in nervous patients, or in persons producing that impression. This characterization contains two notes that must be judged independently: the innate character and the degeneracy. Degeneration. Degeneration is open to the objections that are raised, in general, against the indiscriminate use of that word. It has become customary to attribute to degeneration any type of pathological manifestation that is not strictly traumatic or infectious in origin. The classification of degenerates proposed by Magnan means that even nervous activity with optimal general conformation is not necessarily excluded from the application of this concept. In such circumstances, it is worth asking what usefulness and what new content does the judgment degeneracy possess in general. It seems more appropriate to speak of degeneracy only when, I, there are several serious deviations from the norm, 2, performance and survivability appear seriously impaired. 7. Several facts show that inverts are not degenerates in this legitimate sense of the term. 1. We find the investment in people who do not show any other serious deviations from the norm. 2. We find it in people whose ability to perform is not only not impaired, but who have a particularly high intellectual development and ethical culture. 3. If we disregard the patients that appear to us in our medical experience and try to cover a wider circle, in two directions we come up against facts that prohibit conceiving inversion as a degenerative sign. A. It is necessary to consider that in ancient peoples, at the height of its culture, investment was a frequent phenomenon, almost an institution entrusted with important functions. B. We find it extraordinarily widespread among many savage and primitive peoples, while the concept of degeneration is usually limited to high civilization, bloc, and even among the civilized peoples of Europe, climate and race exert the greatest influence on the diffusion and prosecution of investment. Innate character. As is logical, the innate character has been asserted only with respect to the first class of inverts, the most extreme, and certainly on the basis of the affirmation of these people in the sense that at no time in their lives did it appear in them. Another orientation of the sexual drive. Already the existence of the other two classes, especially the third, the occasional inverts, is hardly compatible with the conception of an innate character. That is why those who hold this opinion are inclined to separate the group of absolute inverts from all the others, which results in the renunciation of a universally valid conception of investment. Accordingly, in a series of cases this would have an innate character, in others, it might have been born differently. Opposed to this conception is the one that affirms that inversion is an acquired character of the sexual drive. It is based on the following considerations. 1. In many inverts, even absolutes, a sexual impression can be traced that affected them early in their lives and whose lasting sequel was the homosexual inclination. 2. In many others it is possible to indicate the favorable and inhibiting external influences that led, earlier or later, to the fixation of the investment: exclusive same-sex treatment, camaraderie in war, detention in prisons, the dangers of the heterosexual trade, celibacy, sexual inadequacy, etc. 3. Inversion can be removed via hypnotic suggestion, which would be amazing if it were innate. Seeing things this way, the very existence of an innate investment can be called into question. It may be objected, Havelock Ellis 1915, that a more precise examination of the cases adduced in favor of innate investment would probably also bring to light an experience of the first childhood that was determinant for the orientation of the libido. This experience would not have been preserved, simply, in the memory concerned by the person, but it would be possible to make him remember it through the appropriate infidelity. According to these authors, the inversion could only be characterized as a frequent variation of the sexual drive, which can be determined by a certain humerus of external vital circumstances. However, the certainty that seems to have been acquired in this way ceases by this observation. To the contrary, it is shown that many people are subjected to these same sexual influences, even in early youth, seduction, mutual onanism, without thereby becoming inverted or remaining durably inverted. Thus, we are led to this conjecture: the innate acquired alternative is incomplete, or does not cover all the situations that the investment poses. Explanation: DK. The investment. The hypothesis that investment is innate does not explain its nature, any more than the hypothesis that it is acquired does. In the first case, it is necessary to point out what is innate in it, otherwise, one would fall into the crudest explanation, namely, that a person brings with him, innate, the link of the sexual drive with a determined sexual object. In the other case, it is worth asking if the multiple accidental influences are enough to explain the acquisition without the necessary solicitation in elgagenkum of something that would exist in the individual. According to our previous points, it is not lawful to deny this last factor. The resource to bisexuality. From Lidston 1889. Kiernan 1888 and Chevalier 1893, a series of ideas that contain a new disagreement with popular opinion have been used to explain the possibility of a sexual inversion. For this, a human being is male or female. But science knows cases in which the sexual characteristics appear blurred and therefore it is difficult to determine the sex, first of all, in the anatomical field. The genitals of these people meet male and female characters, hermaphroditism. In rare cases, the two kinds of sexual apparatus coexist fully developed, true hermaphroditism, but, in the majority, both are atrophied. Now, what is remarkable about these abnormalities is that they unexpectedly make it easier to understand normal formation. Indeed, a certain degree of anatomical hermaphroditism is the norm. In no male or female individual of normal conformation are the traces of the apparatus of the other sex missing, either they have remained functionless, like rudimentary organs, or they have been modified to take on other functions. The conception that results from these long-known anatomical facts is that of an originally bisexual disposition that, in the course of development, is altered until it reaches monosexuality with minimal remains of the atrophied sex. It was suggestive to transfer this conception to the psychic field and understand inversion in its different varieties as an expression of a psychic hermaphroditism. And to settle the matter, all that remains is a regular coincidence between the inversion and the psychic and somatic signs of hermaphroditism. Only this obvious expectation is not met. It is not lawful to conceive of such close relations between the supposed psychic hybridity and the verifiable anatomical hybridity. What is often found in inverts is a decrease in the sexual drive in general, Havelock Ellis 1915, and slight anatomical atrophies of the organs. Often, but not regularly or dominantly. It must be recognized, therefore, that inversion and somatic hermaphroditism are broadly independent of each other. In addition, great importance has been attached to the so-called secondary and tertiary sexual characters and their frequent presence in inverts. In this, too, there is much truth. But it is not licit to forget that the secondary and tertiary characters of one sex appear very frequently in the other. In such cases they are indications of hybridity, but this does not mean that there is a change of the sexual object in the sense of an inversion. Psychic hermaphroditism would gain in credibility if, with the reversal of the sexual object, at least one shift of the other psychic properties, drives and character traits ran parallel, towards the variant that is peculiar to the other sex. But such a reversal of character is only found with any regularity in reversed women. In men, the fullest psychic virility is compatible with inversion. To preserve the thesis of a psychic hermaphroditism, it is necessary to add that its externalizations in the various fields allow to individualize only a few with reciprocal conditioning. The same is true, by the way, for somatic hybridity, according to Halban, 1903, also the atrophies of particular organs and the secondary sexual characteristics occur quite independently of each other. The doctrine of bisexuality has been formulated in its crudest form by a spokesman for male inverts, a female brain in a male body. We just don't know the characters of what a female brain would be. Substituting the psychological problem for the anatomical one is as idle as it is unjustified. Krafft-Ebing's attempt at explanation seems more exactly conceived than Ulrich's, but in essence it does not differ from it. According to Krafft-Ebing 1895a, p. 5, the bisexual disposition endows the individual with both male and female brain centers as well as somatic sexual organs. These centers begin to develop at the time of puberty, most often under the influence of the sexual glands, which are independent of them in constitutional disposition. But about these masculine and feminine centers we can say the same thing that we affirm about the supposed masculine and feminine brain. In the meantime, we do not even know if it is legitimate for us to assume delimited cerebral locations, centers, for sexual functions such as those we know, for example, for language. After these elucidations, two ideas remain standing: a bisexual disposition intervenes in some way in the inversion, only we do not know what it consists of beyond the anatomical conformation. In addition, there are disturbances that affect the sexual drive in its development. Sexual object of inverts. The theory of psychic hermaphroditism presupposes that the sexual object of inverts is the opposite of normal. The inverted man would succumb, like the woman, to the charm that emanates from the properties of the virile body and soul. He would feel himself as a woman and would look for the man. But while this applies to a whole series of inverts, it is far from denoting a universal character of inversion. There is no doubt that a large part of the masculine inverts have retained the psychic character of virility, exhibit relatively few secondary characteristics of the other sex, and in truth seek feminine psychic traits in their sexual object. Otherwise it would be incomprehensible the fact that masculine prostitution, which today as in antiquity is offered to inverts, copies women in all externalizations of dress and bearing. If not, indeed, such an imitation would offend the ideal of inverts. Among the Greeks, where the most virile men were among the inverted, it is clear that what aroused the man's love for the boy was not his masculine character, but his physical resemblance to the woman, as well as his feminine psychic properties, pusillanimity, shyness, need for teaching and help. As soon as the boy became a man, he stopped being a sexual object for the man and perhaps he himself became a lover of the boys. Therefore, in this case as in many others, the sexual object is not the same in terms of sex, but rather combines the characteristics of both sexes, perhaps as a compromise between a motion that aspires to the name and another that aspires to the woman. Always under the condition of the virility of the body, of the genitals so to speak, the mirroring of one's own bisexual nature. It is true that up to now psychoanalysis has not provided full clarification on the origin of the inversion. However, it has revealed the psychic mechanism of its genesis and substantially enriched the statement of the problem. In all the cases investigated, we verified that the people later inverted went through a very intense, but also very brief, phase of fixation on the woman, almost always on the mother, in the early years of their childhood, after which they identified with the woman and they took themselves as a sexual object. That is, from narcissism they looked for young men, and similar to their own person, who should love them as their mother had loved them. In addition, very often we find that presumed inverts were by no means insensitive to the charm of the woman, but transposed to a male object, without interruption, the excitement that she caused them. Thus, throughout their lives they repeated the mechanism for which had spawned their investment. Her compulsive aspiration to the man appeared conditioned by her incessant flight from the woman. In the 1910 edition, the note continued, "It must be borne in mind, however, that up to now only one type of inverts has been subjected to psychoanalysis, individuals whose sexual activity has been generally impaired, and its residue manifested as investment. The problem of reversal is extremely complex and encompasses many different types of sexual activity and development. A clear conceptual distinction should be drawn between different cases of inversion according to whether the sexual character of the object or that of the subject has been inverted. Psychoanalytic research is strictly opposed to the attempt to separate homosexuals as a particular species of human being. Insofar as he studies sexual arousals other than those that make themselves known in an overt manner, he knows that all men are capable of choosing an object of the same sex, and have even consummated it unconsciously. On the other hand, libidinal feelings in association with persons of the same sex play no small role as factors in sexual life, and this role is greater than that of those directed at the opposite sex as motors of contraction of neuroses. Psychoanalysis considers rather that the original from which they develop later, by restriction towards one side or the other, both the normal type and the inverted type, is the independence of the choice of object with respect to the sex of the latter, the open possibility to dispose of both masculine and feminine objects, as can be observed in childhood, in primitive states and in prehistoric times. In the sense of psychoanalysis, then, not even the exclusive sexual interest of the man in the woman is something obvious, but a problem that requires clarification, with respect to which it is possible to suppose an attraction in the background of a chemical nature. The definitive sexual behavior is decided only after puberty, and it is the result of a series of factors that we cannot yet encompass as a whole, and of a partly constitutional, partly accidental nature. By the way, some of these factors can reach a very great force, by virtue of which they gravitate on the result, but, in general, the multiplicity of determinants is reflected by the diversity of outcomes in the overt sexual behavior of human beings. In all types of inverts it is possible to check the sexual object. However, a more circumstantial knowledge could also reveal the existence of a greater variety here. Predominance of archaic constitutions and primitive psychic mechanisms. The validity of the mini-island choice of object and the retention of the erotic importance of the anal zone appear as its most essential characteristics. But nothing is gained if, on the basis of these constitutional properties, the most extreme types of investment are separated from the others. What we think we find in these as a sufficient foundation can also be traced, only to a lesser degree, in the constitution of the transitional types and in the phenotypically normal ones. As much as the differences in results may be qualitative in nature, the analysis shows that the differences in conditions are only quantitative. Among the accidental influences on object choice we have found frustration, early sexual fearfulness, noteworthy, and we have also noted that the presence of both members of the parental pair plays an important role. The lack of a strong father in childhood not infrequently favors investment. Lastly, it is lawful to demand that the inversion of the sexual object be separated, on a conceptual level, from the mixture of sexual characteristics within a subject. A certain degree of independence is also undeniable in this relationship. Ferenczi, 1914, has presented a number of important points of view on the investment problem. He criticizes, rightly, that under the name of homosexuality, which he proposes to substitute for the more appropriate one of homoeroticism, a number of very diverse states are confused, of unequal value both organically and psychologically. He asks for a clear distinction to be made, at least, between these two types, the homoerotico in terms of the subject, who feels like a woman and behaves as such, and the homoerotico in terms of the object, who is entirely masculine and has done nothing more than exchange the female object by one of the same sex. The former he recognizes as genuine sexual intermediaries in the sense of Magnus Hirschfeld, and the latter he characterizes less happily as obsessive neurotics. Only in the case of the homoerotic as regards the object can there be a rebellion against the tendency to inversion, as well as the possibility of psychic influence. Therapy. Even admitting these two types, it is legitimate to add that in many people we find, mixed, a certain degree of homoeroticism regarding the subject with a share of homoeroticism regarding the object. In recent years, the work carried out by biologists, in particular by Eugen Stinich, has shed bright light on the organic conditions of homoeroticism and those of sexual characteristics. Through the experiment of castrating individuals belonging to various species of mammals, with subsequent implantation of germinal glands of the other sex, it was possible to change males into females and vice versa. The move affected more or less completely the somatic sexual characteristics and the psychosexual behavior, that is, eroticism as regards the subject and as regards the object. This sex-determining virtue was considered to be carried not by the germinal glands themselves, which produce the reproductive cells, but by the so-called interstitial tissue of the organ, the puberty glands. In one case, this sexual overturning was achieved in a man who had lost his testicles as a result of tuberculosis. He had behaved like a passive, feminine homosexual, and displayed characters. Sexual goal of inverts. It is important to remember one fact: in no way can one speak of a single sexual goal in the case of inversion. In men, trade per atom and investment do not totally coincide. Masturbation is just as frequently the exclusive goal, and the restrictions of the sexual goal up to the mere effective release are even more common here than in heterosexual love. Also, among inverted women there are multiple sexual goals. Among these, contact with the buccal mucosa seems privileged. Conclusions. It is true that the material presented so far does not enable us to satisfactorily clarify the genesis of the investment. However, we can state that this investigation allowed us to understand something that may turn out to be more important to us than the solution of the indicated task. We stopped in mind that we conceived the link between the sexual drive and the sexual object too close. The experience gathered with the cases considered abnormal teaches us that there is only one weld between the sexual drive and the sexual object, which we ran the risk of not seeing because of the regular correspondence of the normal picture, where the drive seems to bring the object with it. This prescribes that we must loosen, in our conception, the ties between drive and object. Probably, the sexual drive is at the beginning independent of its object, and neither does it owe its genesis to the charms of these secondary sexual drives of a feminine nature, very marked, absence of hair and beard, adipose formations on the breasts and hips. After the implantation of a ectopic testicle of another name, he began to behave masculinely and direct his libido in a normal way towards women. At the same time, the female somatic characters disappeared. It would be unjustified to claim that these magnificent experiments have placed the doctrine of homosexuality on a new footing, just as it would be rash to expect that they would open up a direct path to the universal cure of homosexuality. Fliess rightly pointed out that such experiments do not undermine the doctrine of the universal bisexual disposition of higher animals. It seems to me more likely that further inquiries of this kind will provide direct confirmation of the bisexuality hypothesis. Inverted cases in which genetically immature persons are chosen as sexual objects are presented to the observer as a collectivity of individuals perhaps otherwise valuable. Children seem at first sight to be individual aberrations. Only by exception are children exclusive sexual objects. They almost always come to play this role when a cowardly and impotent individual procures such a surrogate, or when an urgent drive, which does not admit of delay, cannot appropriate a more suitable object at the moment. However that may be, the fact that it admits such a great variation and such reduction of its object, hunger, clinging much more energetically to its object, would admit it only in an extreme case, sheds light on the nature of the sexual drive. A similar observation is valid for the sexual trade with animals, not uncommon among peasants, and in which sexual attraction seems to cross the species barrier. For aesthetic reasons, one would like to attribute these and other serious deviations of the sexual drive to insanity. But this is not correct. Experience teaches that disturbances of the sexual drive are not observed among the insane, different from those found in healthy persons, in races, and in entire estates. Thus, sexual abuse against children occurs with disturbing frequency in teachers and carers, merely because they are offered the best opportunity to do so. The insane present the corresponding deviation only increased, perhaps, or, what is of particular importance, elevated to the status of exclusive practice and in replacement of normal sexual satisfaction. It is sobering to think about this astonishing distribution of sexual variations in the gradation that goes from mental health to mental illness. I would think that this fact, which remains to be explained, would indicate that the motions of the sexual life are among the least dominated by the higher activities of the soul, even in normal persons. In my experience, someone who is mentally abnormal in some other aspect, for example socially or ethically, is also regularly abnormal in their sexual life. But there are many who are abnormal in their sexual life, despite which in all other fields they respond to the norm and have personally traveled the development of human culture, whose weakest point continues to be sexuality. Now, as a more general result of these elucidations, we would extract the following: under a large number of conditions, and in a surprisingly large number of individuals, the class and value of the sexual object pass into the background. Something else is essential and constant in the sexual drive. 2. Deviations from the sexual goal. The union of the genitals is considered the normal sexual goal in the act that is designated as intercourse and that leads to the relief of sexual tension and the temporary extinction of the sexual drive, satisfaction analogous to satiety in the case of hunger. However, already in the most normal sexual act the outlines of what, if fully developed, leads to the aberrations that have been characterized as perversions are announced. Indeed, certain intermediate ways of relating to the sexual object, milestones on the way to coitus, such as touching and looking at it, are recognized as preliminary sexual goals. On the one hand, these practices carry a pleasure in themselves, on the other, they increase the excitement that must be maintained until the final sexual goal is reached. In addition, one of these contacts, that of the two labial mucous membranes, has been given in many peoples, including those of the highest civilization, a high sexual value, even though the intervening body parts do not belong to the apparatus, but rather constitute the entrance to the digestive tract. This offers us, then, aspects that link perversions to normal sexual life, applicable even to their classification. The perversions are, either, a. anatomical transgressions regarding the areas of the body destined for sexual union, or b. delays in intermediary relationships with the sexual object, relationships that are normally covered quickly as milestones on the road to the sexual goal. Definitive. A. Anatomical violations. Overestimation of the sexual object. The psychic esteem in which the sexual object is made to participate as the desired goal of the sexual drive is limited only in the rarest cases to its genitals. Rather, it encompasses his entire body and tends to include all the sensations that originate from the sexual object. The same overestimation radiates to the psychic field and manifests itself as logical blindness, weakness of judgment, regarding the psychic products and the perfections of the sexual object, and also as credulous obedience to the judgments that proceed from the latter. The credulity of love thus becomes an important source, if not the original source, of authority and good. This sexual overestimation is what barely tolerates the restriction of the sexual goal to the union of the genitals proper and contributes to elevating chores related to other parts of the body to the status of sexual goals. The importance of this factor of sexual overestimation can best be studied in the man, whose love life is the only one that has become accessible to research, while that of the woman remains shrouded in still impenetrable darkness, partly because of cultural atrophy, but partly also because of the conventional reserve and insincerity of women. 15. I cannot help but recall in connection with this the credulous obedience of the hypnotized to his hypnotist, which makes me suspect that the essence of hypnosis has to be located in the unconscious fixation of the libido on the person of the hypnotist, by means of the components masochists of the sexual drive. Added in 1910, Ferenczi has linked this character of suggestibility with the hunger for stimulation, adduced by Hockey and Bloch to explain the transfer of sexual interest to other parts of the body besides the genitals. It does not seem to me worth the importance that they give you. The various paths by which the libido migrates behave from the beginning with each other as communicating vessels, and it is necessary to take into account the phenomenon of collateral current. Sexual use of the mucosa of the lips and of the mouth. The use of the mouth as a sexual organ is considered perversion when the lips, tongue, of one person come into contact with the genitals of the other, but not when both put their labial mucosa in contact. In this last exception resides the nodding with the normal. Whoever, considering them perversions, abhors other practices, usual without a doubt since the original times of humanity, gives into a clear feeling of disgust that protects him from accepting a sexual goal of this kind. However, the limits of that disgust are often purely conventional. He who kisses the lips of a beautiful girl with unction might use his toothbrush with disgust, even though he has no grounds for supposing that his own oral cavity, which does not cause him disgust, is cleaner than the girl's. This factor of disgust hinders the path to libidinous overestimation of the sexual object, but in turn it can be overcome by libido. In disgust one would like to discern one of the powers that have produced the restriction of the sexual goal. They stop, as a rule, at the genitals, but there is no doubt that the genitals of the other sex, in and of themselves, can also constitute an object of disgust, and this behavior is one of the characteristics of hysterics, especially women. The force of the sexual drive likes to assert itself by overcoming this disgust. Sexual use of the anal orifice. With regard to the use of the anus, it is recognized even more clearly than in the previous case that it is disgust that puts the stamp of perversion on this sexual goal. But do not impute partisanship to me if I observe that the fact that this part of the body serves excretion and comes into contact with what is disgusting itself, the excrement, is not, as a basis for disgust, much more conclusive than that adduced by the hysterical girls to explain their disgust towards the male genitals, which are used for urination. The sexual role of the anal mucosa is by no means restricted to trade between men. The predilection for him is not characteristic of the sensitivity of inverts either. On the contrary, it seems that the pedicatio of the man owes its role to the analogy with the act in the case of the woman, while reciprocal masturbation is the sexual goal that appears predominantly in the trade of inverts. Significance of other places of the body. The sexual overflow towards other places of the body, with all its variations, does not offer anything new in principle. Nothing adds to the knowledge of the sexual drive, which in this does nothing but proclaim its purpose of seizing the sexual object in all its dimensions. But in anatomical transgressions, together with sexual overestimation, another factor that is alien to popular knowledge is announced. Certain places on the body, such as the buccal and anal mucosa, which appear again and again in these practices, raise the claim, so to speak, of being considered and treated as genitalia themselves. We will come to learn that this claim is justified by the development of the sexual drive and is satisfied in the symptomatology of certain pathological states. Inappropriate substitute for the sexual object. Fetish. A totally particular aspect is offered by cases in which the normal sexual object is replaced by another that is related to it, but is completely inappropriate to serve the normal sexual goal. With a view to classification, it would have been better if we had mentioned this extremely interesting group of aberrations of the sexual drive, already when speaking of deviations with respect to the sexual object. But we postponed it until we became aware of the factor of sexual overestimation, on which these phenomena depend, which lead to an abandonment of the sexual goal. The substitute for the sexual object is, in general, a part of the body that is not very suitable for a sexual purpose, the foot, the hair, or an inanimate object that maintains a demonstrable relationship with the sexual person, preferably with his sexuality, clothing, underwear. Not without success has this substitute been compared to the fetish in which the savage sees his god incarnated. The cases in which a fetishistic condition is required of the sexual object in order to achieve the sexual goal, certain hair color, certain clothes, even physical defects, constitute the transition to cases of fetishism in which a normal sexual goal is renounced or perverse. No other variant of the sexual drive that borders on the pathological has attracted our interest as much as that one, because of the strange phenomena to which it gives rise. A prerequisite in all cases seems to be a certain lowering of the puja towards the normal sexual goal, executive weakness of the sexual apparatus. The nodding with the normal is sought by the overestimation of the sexual object, which is psychologically necessary. It is inevitable that it invades everything connected with the object by association. Therefore, a certain degree of this type of fetishism regularly belongs to normal love, particularly in the stages of falling in love in which the normal sexual goal is unattainable or its fulfillment seems delayed. Give me a handkerchief from her bosom, a garter for the love I feel. The pathological case occurs only when the aspiration to the fetish fixes itself, exceeding the mentioned condition, and replaces the normal sexual goal, and also, when the fetish is detached from that determined person and becomes a sexual object itself. These are the general conditions for mere variations in the sexual drive to become pathological deviations. In the choice of the fetish, the persistent influence of a sexual impression almost always received in early childhood is manifested. Binet 1888 was the first to assert it, and it was later abundantly documented. This can be compared with the proverbial survival of first love in normal people, en revient toujours à ses premiers amours. Such a derivation is particularly clear in cases that present a mere fetishistic conditioning of the sexual object. Elsewhere we shall come across the significance of early sexual impressions. In other cases it is a symbolic connection of thoughts, most of the time not conscious for the individual, which has led to the substitution of the object for the fetish. The paths of these connections cannot always be pointed out with certainty. The foot is an archaic sexual symbol, already in myth. The skin asterisk undoubtedly owes its fetish role to the association with the hairy formation of the mons veneris. However, this symbolism does not always seem to be independent of childhood sexual experiences either. Emergence of new purposes. All the external and internal conditions that make it difficult to achieve the normal sexual goal or postpone it, impotence, the high price of the sexual object, the dangers of the sexual act, reinforce, as it is logical that it happens, the inclination to delay in the preliminary acts already constitute from them new sexual goals that can replace the normal ones. A closer examination always shows that these new purposes, even the most strange in appearance, are already outlined in the normal sexual act. Touch and look. At least for human beings, some degree of use of touch seems indispensable for the achievement of the normal sexual goal. It is also universally known what source of pleasure, on the one hand, and what rush of new excitement, on the other, are obtained from the sensations of contact with the skin of the sexual object. Therefore, delay in touching, as long as the sexual act goes ahead, can hardly be counted among the perversions. Something similar occurs with looking, derived in the last analysis from touching. The optical impression continues to be the most frequent path by which libidinal excitation is aroused. And natural selection rests on the traversability of this path if this teleological approach is permitted, to the extent that it makes the sexual object develop in the sense of beauty. The concealment of the body, which progresses along with human culture, keeps sexual curiosity awake, which aspires to complete the sexual object by revealing the hidden parts. However, it can be diverted, sublimated, in the realm of art, if one can direct one's interest away from the genitalia to the shape of the body as a whole. Most normal people linger to some degree at that intermediary goal of sexually tinged looking. And this even gives them the possibility of directing a certain amount of their libido to higher artistic goals. On the contrary, the pleasure of seeing becomes a perversion when, a. it is confined exclusively to the genitals, b. joins the overcoming of disgust, voyeur, the one who looks at another in his excretory functions, or c. supplants Verdrangen the normal sexual goal, instead of serving as a preliminary. This last case is, markedly, that of the exhibitionists, who, if I may infer it after numerous analyses, in the perversion whose aspiration consists in looking and being looked at, an astonishing feature comes to light, which we will have to deal with more intensely as a result of the aberration that follows, namely, the sexual goal is presented in a double configuration, actively and passively. The power that opposes the pleasure of seeing and that, if necessary, is suppressed by it, as it happened in the previous case with disgust, is shame. Sadism and masochism. The inclination to inflict pain on the sexual object and its counterpart, the most frequent and important of all perversions, has been baptized by Krafft-Ebing in its two forms, the active and the passive, as sadism and passive masochism. Other authors, p. example Schrinknotzing, 1899, prefer the stricter designation of algolagnia, which emphasizes pleasure from pain, cruelty, while the names chosen by Krafft-Ebing foreground pleasure from any kind of humiliation and subjugation. It is easy to investigate in normal people the roots of active algolagnia, sadism. The sexuality of most males exhibits a component of aggression, a tendency to subdue, whose biological value may lie in the need to overcome the resistance of the sexual object in another way as well, not only through acts of courtship. Sadism would respond, then, to an aggressive component of the sexual drive, a component that has become autonomous, exaggerated, elevated by displacement descending to the main role. In common language, the concept of sadism ranges from a merely active, or even violent, attitude towards the sexual object to submission and mistreatment inflicted on it. The latter as the exclusive condition of satisfaction. In a strict sense, only this second, extreme case deserves the name of perversion. Similarly, the designation masochism covers all passive attitudes towards life and the sexual object, the most extreme of which is the conditioning of satisfaction on the fact of suffering physical or mental pain inflicted by the sexual object. As a perversion, masochism seems to stray further from the normal sexual goal than its counterpart. In the first place, it may be doubted that it ever appears primarily, perhaps it is born, regularly, by transformation from sadism. 8 It can often be recognized that masochism is nothing other than a continuation of sadism turned towards one's own person, which at first acts as the sexual object. The clinical analysis of extreme cases of masochistic perversion makes us see the cooperation of a vast series of factors that exaggerate and fix the original passive sexual attitude, castration complex, guilty conscience. The pain thus overcome aligns itself with disgust and shame, which oppose the libido as resistances. Sadism and masochism occupy a particular position among perversions, since the opposition between activity and passivity that is at their base belongs to the universal characteristics of sexual life. The history of human culture teaches us, beyond any doubt, that cruelty and the sexual drive belong together in the closest way. To clarify this link, however, it has not gone beyond insisting on the aggressive component of the libido. According to some authors, that aggression that is mixed with the sexual drive is really a remainder of cannibalistic appetites. It would be, then, a co-participation of the apparatus of seizure, which serves the satisfaction of the other great need, ontogenetically older. Has also been held that all pain contains, in and of itself, the possibility of a pleasant sensation. Here we will content ourselves with pointing out an impression. The clarification of these perversions has not been in any way satisfactory, and it is possible that various psychic aspirations come together in a single effect. Now, the most striking property of this perversion is that its active form and its passive form are usually found together in the same person. He who feels pleasure in causing pain to another in a sexual relationship is also capable of enjoying the pain that derives from sexual relations as pleasure. A sadist is always also a masochist at the same time, although one of the two aspects of perversion, the passive or the active, may have developed in him more strongly and constitute his prevailing sexual practice. Thus, we see that some of the perverse inclinations are regularly presented as pairs of opposites, which, by reference to material to be provided later, may have great theoretical significance. It is also illuminating that the existence of the pair of opposites sadism-masochism cannot simply be derived from the interference of an aggressive component. On the contrary, we would be tempted to relate the simultaneous presence of these opposites with the opposition of the masculine and the feminine, conjugated in bisexuality. Psychoanalysis often finds itself forced to replace this last opposition by that which mediates between active and passive. 3. General considerations on all perversions. Variation and disease. The physicians who first studied perversions in well-accused cases and under particular circumstances were inclined, of course, to attribute to them the character of a pathological or degenerative sign, just as they did with respect to inversion. However, in the case at hand it is easier to reject this point of view. Everyday experience has shown that most of these transgressions, even the least annoying of them, are an ingredient of sexual life that is rarely lacking in healthy people, who judge them like any other intimacy. If circumstances favor it, the normal person can also replace the normal sexual goal for a whole period with a perversion of this kind or make a place for it next to it. No healthy person will lack some complement to the normal sexual goal that could be called perverse, and this universality alone suffices to show how inappropriate it is to use the name perversion disapprovingly. In the field of sexual life, precisely, difficulties are encountered truly insoluble for now, if one wants to draw a sharp limit between what is mere variation within the physiological amplitude and pathological symptoms. However that may be, in many of these perversions the quality of the new sexual goal is such that it requires particular appreciation. Some of them are so far from the normal due to their content that we cannot avoid declaring them pathological, particularly those in which the sexual drive performs astonishing operations, licking excrement, abusing corpses, overcoming resistance, shame, disgust, horror, pain. But not even in these cases can there be the certain expectation that they are regularly dealing with people with other serious abnormalities, or with mental illnesses. Here, too, it is not possible to overlook the fact that people who in all other respects have normal conduct claim to be sick only in the field of sexual life, under the rule of the most indomitable of drives. In contrast, manifest abnormality in other vital relationships invariably shows a background of abnormal sexual behavior. In most cases we can find a pathological character in perversion, not because of the content of the new sexual goal, but because of its proportion with respect to the normal. If the perversion does not appear together with the normal sexual goal and object, when favorable circumstances promote it and other unfavorable ones prevent the normal, but supplants Verdrangen and replaces the normal in all circumstances, we almost always consider it legitimate to judge it as a pathological symptom. We see the latter, therefore, in exclusivity and in the fixation of perversion. The contribution of the mood in the perversions. Perhaps precisely in the most horrifying perversions it is necessary to admit the vastest psychic contribution to the transmutation of the sexual drive. Here is a work of mental work that cannot be denied, despite its horrible result, the value of an idealization of the drive. Perhaps nowhere is love's omnipotence on display more forcefully than in these detours of its own. In sexuality, the most sublime and the most nefarious appear everywhere in intimate dependence, from heaven, through the world, to hell. 2 results. The study of perversions has provided us with this understanding: the sexual drive has to fight against certain psychic powers as resistance, among them, shame and disgust stand out most clearly. It is legitimate to conjecture that these powers have contributed to circumscribe the drive within the borders considered normal, and that if they developed early in the individual, before the sexual drive reached its full strength, it was precisely they who set the direction of its development. We have also observed that some of the investigated perversions could only be understood by the combination of several reasons. If they admit of an analysis, a decomposition, they must be of a composite nature. Hence we can conjecture that perhaps the sexual drive is not something simple, but consists of components that separate again in perversions. The clinic would thus have revealed to us the existence of fusions that do not reveal themselves as such in normal uniform behavior. 17. 4. The sexual drive in neurotics. The psychoanalysis. An important contribution to the knowledge of the sexual drive in people who are at least close to normality is obtained from a source available in a unique and special way. To obtain exhaustive and accurate information about the sexual life of the so-called psychoneurotics, those who suffer from hysteria, obsessive neurosis, the falsely called neurasthenia, certainly also dementia praecox and paranoia, 38, there is only one way: subjecting them to psychoanalytic exploration, which is used by the therapeutic procedure introduced by Joseph Breuer and myself in 1893, and then called cathartic. I must anticipate, repeating what I have said in other publications, that these psychoneuroses, as far as my experiences go, rest on drive forces of a sexual nature. By this I do not mean that the energy of the sexual drive makes a mere contribution to the forces that sustain pathological phenomena, symptoms, but rather expressly assert that this participation is the only constant energy source of neuroses, and the most important, so that the sexual life of the affected persons is externalized exclusively, or predominantly, or only partially, in these symptoms. As I have expressed in another play 30, the symptoms are the sexual practice of the patients. The proof of this assertion has been provided to me by a growing number of psychoanalyses of hysterics and other neurotics, which I have been conducting for 25 years, the results of which I have given detailed reasons elsewhere, and will continue to do so. Psychoanalysis eliminates the symptoms of hysterics under the premise that they are the substitute, the transcript, so to speak, of a series of psychic processes invested with affection, desires, and aspirations, which by virtue of a particular psychic process, the repression, have been denied, frustrated, access to their processing in a psychic activity susceptible to conscience. And then, these thought formations that have been relegated to the state of the unconscious aspire to an expression proportioned to their affective value, to a discharge, and in the case of hysteria they find it in the process of conversion into somatic phenomena, precisely, hysterical symptoms. Now, following certain rules, with the help of a particular technique, it is possible to retransform the symptoms into representations that have now become conscious, invested with affect, and thus the most exact inquiry about the nature and lineage of these formerly unconscious psychic formations is achieved. Results achieved by psychoanalysis. In this way it was discovered that the symptoms are a substitute for aspirations that take their strength from the source of the sexual drive. It fully harmonizes with this what we know about the character of hysterics. We take them as a model for all psychoneurotics, before contracting their illness, and about the occasions of the latter. The hysterical character allows individualizing a quota of sexual repression that far exceeds the normal measure, an increase in resistance to the sexual drive, resistance that we know as shame, disgust, and morality, a kind of instinctive flight from any intellectual examination of the sexual problem, which in the most pronounced cases has the consequence of maintaining total sexual ignorance even after reaching reproductive maturity. This character trait, essential in hysteria, is not infrequently hidden from superficial observation by the presence of the second constitutional factor of hysteria, the hyperpotent display übermächtig of the sexual drive. Only psychological analysis knows how to discover it in all cases and solve the enigmatic and contradictory nature of hysteria by verifying the existence of this pair of opposites, a hypertrophic sexual need Übergross and a disavowal of the sexual taken too far. The occasion to become ill presents itself for the person with a hysterical disposition when, as a result of his own progressive maturation or of the external circumstances of his life, the objective sexual demand becomes serious for him. Between the effort of the drive and the counteracting action of sexual disavowal lies the recourse to illness. This does not provide a solution to the conflict, but rather an attempt to escape from it by turning libidinous aspirations into symptoms. 43 The fact that a hysterical person, for example a man, falls ill as a result of a trivial emotion, of a conflict in whose center is not located sexual interest, is no more than an apparent exception. In such cases, psychoanalysis can regularly demonstrate that it was the sexual component of the conflict that made contracting the disease possible, removing the mental processes from normal processing. Neurosis and perversion. Much of the opposition that these theses of mine have aroused is explained by the fact that the sexuality from which I derive the psychoneurotic symptoms is made to coincide with the normal sexual drive. But psychoanalysis still teaches something more. It shows that the symptoms are in no way born solely at the expense of the so-called normal sexual drive, not, at least, exclusively or predominantly, but that they constitute the converted expression convertiert of drives that would be designated perverse, in the most lato, if they could be directly externalized, without diffraction by consciousness, in designs of fantasy and in actions. Therefore, the symptoms are formed in part at the expense of abnormal sexuality. Neurosis is, so to speak, the negative of perversion. The sexual drive of psychoneurotics allows us to discern all the aberrations that we have studied in the foregoing as variations with respect to normal sexual life and as manifestations of the pathological one. 2. In the unconscious psychic life of all neurotics, without exception, there are reversal movements, fixation of the libido in people of the same sex. Without a deep elucidation, it is not possible to properly appreciate the importance of this factor for the configuration of the pathological picture. I can only assure you that the unconscious inclination to inversion is never lacking and, in particular, it renders the greatest services to the elucidation of masculine hysteria. B. In the unconscious of psychoneurotics, all inclinations to anatomical transgression can be searched for as symptom formers, among them, with particular frequency and intensity, those that claim the role of the genitals for the oral and anal mucosa. C. Among the symptom formers of the psychoneuroses, the partial drives 46 play an outstanding role, which most often appear in pairs of opposites. We have already become aware of them as promoters of new sexual goals, the drive for the pleasure of seeing an exhibition, and the drive for cruelty, configured actively and passively. The contribution of the latter becomes indispensable to understand the painful nature of the symptoms, and almost regularly governs a part of the social conduct of the sick. Through this link between the libido and cruelty, there is also the change from love to hate, from tender to hostile impulses, characteristic of a whole series of cases of neurosis and even, it seems, of paranoia as a whole. The interest in these results increases even more if some particularities that the factual material presents are taken into account. No. Whenever a drive of this kind is discovered in the unconscious, capable of being coupled with an opposite, as a general rule it can be shown that the latter also produces effects. Therefore, every active perversion is here accompanied by its passive counterpart. Whoever is an exhibitionist in the unconscious is at the same time a voyeur. Whoever suffers the consequences of the repression of sadistic impulses, receives another supplement to his symptoms from the sources of a masochistic inclination. It is certainly very remarkable the agreement with the behavior of the corresponding positive perversions, but in pathological pictures one or other of the opposite inclinations plays the prevailing role. 0. In a more pronounced case of psychoneurosis, one rarely finds a single one of these perverse drives. More often than not, we find a large number of them and, as a general rule, traces of all of them. However, the intensity of each singular drive is independent of the development of the others. On this point, too, the study of positive perversions provides us with the exact counterpart. By drive we can understand at the outset nothing more than the psychic representative agency repaired sentence of a continuously flowing intrasomatic source of stimuli. This is different from the stimulus, which is produced by singular excitations coming from outside. Thus, drive is one of the concepts of the delimitation of the psychic with respect to the corporal. The simplest and most obvious hypothesis about the nature of the drives would be this: in themselves they do not have any quality, but rather they must be considered only as a measure of work demand for mental life. What distinguishes drives from one another and endows them with specific properties is their relationship to their somatic sources and to their goals. The source of the drive is an excitatory process within an organ, and its immediate goal is to cancel that organ's stimulus. Another provisional hypothesis in the doctrine of the drives, which we cannot omit here, reads as follows: the organs of the body provide excitations of two kinds, based on differences of a chemical nature. We designate one of these kinds of excitation as specifically sexual, and the affected organ as the erogenous zone of the partial sexual drive that stems from it. In the case of perverse inclinations that claim sexual value bedeutung for the oral cavity and anal opening, the role of the erogenous zone is plainly visible. In all respects it behaves as a part of the genital apparatus. In the case of hysteria, these parts of the body and the mucosal tracts that arise from them become the seat of new sensations and innervation alterations and even of processes comparable to erection, all similar to those of the true genitalia under the excitations of the normal sexual processes. Among the psychoneuroses, it is in hysteria that the significance of the erogenous zones as collateral and surrogate devices of the genitalia stands out most clearly, but this does not imply affirming that they should be underestimated in other forms of disease. In these, obsessive neurosis, paranoia, it is only less notorious, since the formation of symptoms takes place in regions of the mental apparatus that are further away from the various centers that govern the body. In obsessive neurosis, what is most striking is the importance of impulses, which create new sexual goals and seem independent of erogenous zones. However, in the pleasure of seeing and showing off, the eye corresponds to an erogenous zone. In the case of pain and cruelty as components of the sexual drive, it is the skin that assumes the same role, the skin, which in certain parts of the body has differentiated into the sense organs and has been modified to the point of constitute a mucosa, and which is, therefore, the erogenous zone par excellence. The foregoing elucidations may have cast the sexuality of psychoneurotics in a false light. Perhaps they suggested that, by virtue of their disposition, they become very close to the wicked in their sexual conduct, distancing themselves from the normal in equal measure. Now, it is very possible that the constitutional disposition of these patients contains, along with a hypertrophic degree of sexual repression and a hyperpotency of the sexual drive, an unusual inclination to perversion in the broadest sense. However, the investigation of milder cases shows that this last assumption is not essential, or that at least in the judgment about its pathological effects, the action of another factor must be subtracted. In the majority of psychoneurotics, the disease is contracted only after puberty and under the demands of a normal sexual life. Against this, above all, repression aims. Or it is contracted later, when the normal satisfaction pathways of the libido are frustrated. In either case, the libido behaves like a current whose main channel is cut off. It then fills the collateral pathways that until then perhaps had remained empty. Thus, the seemingly great inclination of psychoneurotics to perversion, the negative inclination, it is true, may be collaterally conditioned, and in any case, its increase has to be collateral. The fact is, precisely, that it is necessary to align sexual repression, as an internal factor, together with external factors, such as the restriction of freedom, the inaccessibility of the normal sexual object, the dangers that the normal sexual act entails, etc., generate perversions in individuals who otherwise might have continued to be normal. In different cases of neuroses the proportions may vary in this. One time the decisive factor will be the innate strength of the perverse inclination, another time its collateral enhancement by retraction of the libido of the normal sexual goal and object. It would be wrong to assume an opposition where there is a nexus of cooperation. Neurosis will always achieve its maximum achievements when the constitution and the experience cooperate in the same sense. A pronounced constitution may perhaps dispense with the support of vital impressions, and perhaps a vast vital commotion will provoke neurosis even in an ordinary constitution. For the rest, these points of view are valid in the same way in other fields regarding the etiological significance of innate IQ and the accidentally experienced. But if the hypothesis is preferred that a particularly marked inclination to perversions is one of the peculiarities of the psychoneurotic constitution, the perspective opens of being able to distinguish a range of such constitutions according to the innate preponderance of this or that erogenous zone, of this or this other partial drive. As with so much in this field, whether perverse disposition particularly corresponds to choice of disease form has not yet been investigated. 7. Reference to the infantilism of sexuality. With the investigation of perverse motions as symptom formers in psychoneuroses, we have extraordinarily increased the number of men who could be described as perverse. Not only the neurotics themselves constitute a very numerous class, it must also be borne in mind that from all forms of neuroses, descending series can be established, without solution of continuity, up to health. That is why Mobius was able to say, with good grounds, that we are all a bit hysterical. Thus, the extraordinary diffusion of perversions forces us to suppose that the disposition for them is not a rare particularity either, but that it has to form part of the constitution considered normal. It is debatable, as we said, whether the perversions go back to innate conditions or are born, as Binet supposed with respect to fetishism by virtue of contingent experiences. Now we are offered this resolution of the dilemma: at the base of the perversions there is in all cases something innate, but something that is innate in all men, even though its intensity fluctuates and may be enhanced over time by vital influences. It is about innate roots of the sexual drive, given in the constitution itself, which in a series of cases, perversions, develop to become the real carriers of sexual activity. Other times they experience insufficient suffocation, repression, as a result of which they can draw to themselves by way of pathological symptoms a considerable part of the sexual energy, while in the most favored cases, situated between the two extremes, they allow, through effective restriction and some other processing, the genesis of the so-called normal sexual life. But we must also tell ourselves that this presumed construction, the constitution that exhibits the germs of all perversions, can only be traced in the child, even though in him all the drives can only emerge with moderate intensity. Thus we glimpse a formula: neurotics have retained the infantile state of their sexuality or have been remitted to it. Thus, our interest is directed to the sexual life of the child. We will study the play of influences by virtue of which the process of development of infantile sexuality ends in perversion, in neurosis, or in normal sexual life. And the sexual aberrations. Sigmund Freud.